October 21st. The Black Sea, 10,000 feet above international waters. A U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft was holding its assigned track, sensors running, crew at stations. Routine, professional, unremarkable, until the moment it wasn't. A Russian Sukhoi Su-27 flanker closed to within 10 feet of the P-8A's fuselage, 10 feet at 500 knots. That is not a near miss. That is a decision. And what happened next had nothing to do with guns, missiles, or any of the hardware that fills a defense procurement budget. It had everything to do with the vast, invisible architecture of information superiority that the United States had quietly built around that aircraft long before the Russian pilot even strapped into his seat. The Black Sea is not incidental geography. It is a pressure point, the seam where NATO's eastern flank meets Russia's most sensitive military infrastructure, where commercial shipping routes connecting Europe to Asia thread between competing claims of sovereignty and legitimate access. Russia's Black Sea Fleet calls Sevastopol home. Crimea, annexed in 2014, gives Moscow its southern airspace buffer. For the Russian military, this body of water is strategically intimate. For the United States, maintaining freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight in international airspace here is a matter of principle, precedent, and signal. The P-8A Poseidon is Boeing's militarized 737. That framing undersells it considerably. It carries an AN/APS-154 advanced airborne sensor suite capable of generating high-resolution synthetic aperture radar imagery of surface contacts regardless of weather conditions. Its acoustic processing systems handle data from sonobuoys with a fidelity that can classify submarine types by the harmonic signature of their machinery. It records everything: spectrum emissions, radar waveforms, transponder codes, visual imagery, continuously, simultaneously, and at a quality that holds up in classified briefings and, when necessary, international press conferences. The crew flying this mission was not there to escalate. Their tasking was surveillance of international territory, monitoring shipping activity, cataloging electronic emissions from Russian military assets, logging flight operations from Crimean air bases. What they were not expecting, and what their training had prepared them for anyway, was a direct kinetic challenge from a Russian interceptor with its transponder dark and its radio silent. The Su-27 flanker is not a subtle aircraft, powered by two Saturn AL-31F turbofans generating 27,000 pounds of thrust each. It is one of the most capable pure air superiority platforms Russia has ever produced. Agile, fast, and designed specifically to intercept and destroy exactly the category of aircraft the P-8A represents. When a flanker goes to full military power in a climbing turn toward a maritime patrol aircraft, every sensor on that patrol aircraft registers the event simultaneously. What the Russian pilot did not know, and what Moscow's planners apparently failed to account for, was that the P-8A was not alone in any meaningful operational sense. At high altitude nearby, an E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control system aircraft was holding its own orbit, its rotating radar antenna sweeping a volume of airspace spanning 250 nautical miles in every direction from its position. The E-3 is not a combat aircraft. It does not carry weapons. What it carries is a real-time fused picture of everything moving through its coverage envelope: surface contacts, airborne tracks, electronic emissions, integrated and distributed over secure data link to every platform connected to the network it anchors. The P-8A was connected. The moment the Su-27 departed its Crimean airbase and began its intercept profile, the AWACS had a track solution, a classification, and a projected intercept point. That data flowed to the P-8A before the Russian pilot had reached cruise altitude. The element of surprise Russia was counting on had already expired. Inside the P-8A, the crew's tactical displays showed the Su-27's bearing, altitude, speed, 600 knots on final closure, and its precise geometric relationship to their aircraft. The threat vector was unambiguous. The time to the first intercept point was 30 seconds. Through the aircraft's optical targeting system, the American flight crew watched the flanker approach, its afterburner cones visible in the infrared band. Heart rates remained steady. This is what training at this level produces. Not the absence of recognition that the situation is dangerous, but the elimination of the physiological response that degrades decision-making when it is. The question moving through the crew's internal communications was precise and operational. Is this a unilateral action by a pilot operating outside his brief? Or is this a structured probe, a Kremlin-sanctioned test of American rules of engagement designed to establish behavioral precedent in contested airspace. The answer would determine whether the next 10 minutes remained an incident or became something considerably more consequential. The Su-27 cut across the P-8A's flight path at 10 feet of separation, then executed a barrel roll directly ahead of the American aircraft's nose. The physics of this maneuver are not subtle. A large fighter at high speed generates wingtip vortices, columns of rotating air that extend behind the aircraft like horizontal tornadoes. At 25 feet of separation during the roll, those vortices intersected directly with the P-8A's flight path. For a 140,000-pound maritime patrol aircraft, entering that wake turbulence at low separation is not a controllable inconvenience. It is a structural and aerodynamic emergency that can develop faster than crew response time allows. The P-8A's crew held their heading. They did not maneuver. They did not respond on radio. They let the data recording systems run, and they flew the aircraft. This was not passivity. It was the coldest possible form of operational discipline, refusing to give the Russian pilot the reaction his maneuver was designed to provoke, while simultaneously converting his aggression into high-resolution evidence that would later be released publicly, turning a private intimidation attempt into an internationally documented demonstration of Russian unprofessionalism. Russia's tactical assumption at this stage was straightforward. One isolated reconnaissance aircraft, caught off guard, operating without immediate air cover, would deviate from its assigned track. Conceding airspace, establishing a precedent that Russian provocations produce behavioral change in U.S. operations. It was a reasonable assumption based on a completely incorrect picture of what the P-8A actually was within the larger operational system. Two Su-30 flanker variants, the more advanced thrust-vectoring-capable sibling of the Su-27, with a top speed of Mach 2.35 and a multi-role weapons payload, were detected lifting off from Sevastopol Naval Air Station. The AWACS tracked both from the moment their wheels left the runway. Their intercept geometry was calculated before they had finished their initial climb. Their weapons loadout was assessed from their radar and electronic signatures before they reached their operating altitude. The intent was legible. Use speed and numbers to establish an encirclement geometry around the P-8A, forcing either an evasive departure from the patrol area or a provocation that could be characterized as American aggression. The fatal structural weakness of this plan was that Russian tactical aviation, at the time of this incident, operated on platforms that lacked the data link architecture to share sensor data between aircraft in real time. Each Su-27 and Su-30 pilot could only see what his own radar could show him. They were three separate threat vectors, not a coordinated network. They were outnumbered in the information domain 3-0 by an American operational system that had been stitching together satellite feeds, AWACS tracks, and P-8A sensor data into a single coherent picture since before the first Russian aircraft had taxied. From the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, holding position 200 nautical miles west, two F/A-18E Super Hornets were launched. They accelerated through Mach 1.2 with their AN/APG-79 active electronically scanned array radars in receive-only mode, listening, scanning, building their tactical picture entirely from the data link feed rather than from their own emissions. This meant their radar cross-section to Russian sensors was that of an aircraft that wasn't looking. They were invisible in the most operationally useful sense, not physically undetectable, but giving no indication of their awareness or intent until the moment that calculation changed. The AIM-120D advanced medium-range air-to-air missile they carried has a maximum engagement range that classified sources suggest exceeds 100 nautical miles. Russia's equivalent best-in-class air-to-air weapon reaches approximately half that distance. The Super Hornet pilots could have engaged the Su-30AES before those aircraft's own radar systems could have painted them as threats. The engagement geometry was not a competition, it was a mathematical conclusion. Beneath the aerial confrontation, the P-8A's acoustic systems had acquired a separate contact, a Kilo-class diesel-electric attack submarine, operating at periscope depth approximately 40 nautical miles from the P-8A's track. The Kilo-class is a competent and quiet submarine when operating on battery power. Its vulnerability is the requirement to periodically run its diesel engines to recharge those batteries, a process that requires snorkeling at shallow depth and generates an acoustic and electronic signature that modern maritime patrol sensors are specifically designed to detect. The submarine's commander believed he was an unobserved observer. The P-8A's systems had classified his vessel by machinery noise signature before he was aware the patrol aircraft was within acoustic range. An MH-60R Seahawk helicopter, deployed from an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operating in support of the P-8A's mission, arrived on station and began deploying AN/SSQ-53D FAR sonobuoys in a barrier pattern around the submarine's position. Each buoy is 4.875 inches in diameter and 36 inches long, a disposable passive acoustic sensor that radios its data to the helicopter overhead. The pattern established an acoustic perimeter the submarine could not transit without providing continuous positional data. The Seahawk crew locked a firing solution on the contact and logged it. No weapon was released. The submarine's commander was tracked, documented, and rendered operationally transparent without knowing any of it had occurred. The message, had he known it was being sent, "You were never anonymous here." The Su-27 pilot's final escalatory move was the activation of his N001 MIAC fire control radar in targeting mode. A lock-on that, in the language of military aviation, carries the same meaning as drawing a weapon and pointing it. Simultaneously, he initiated electronic jamming, broadcasting noise across the frequencies used by the P-8A's sensor suite in an attempt to blind it and force a reactive response. The P-8A's AN/ALQ-240 electronic warfare system processed both inputs within milliseconds. The jamming signal was not simply blocked. It was captured, analyzed, amplified, and returned to the source with modifications, a technique that uses the aggressor's own emissions as the carrier for a counterattack. On the Su-27 pilot's radar display, the single P-8A return vanished. In its place, hundreds of contacts filling his scope from edge to edge, indistinguishable from one another, all moving in plausible flight profiles. His fire control solution, the product of his targeting radar lock, was now pointing at nothing real. His situational awareness had not been degraded, it had been replaced with a carefully constructed fiction. His communications were jammed simultaneously, cutting him off from the other Russian aircraft and from his ground controllers. He was alone in contested airspace with no sensor picture, no communications, and no way to distinguish his actual threat environment from an electronic hallucination. His transmission back to base was brief and controlled, but its content was telling: radar malfunction, fire control system unresponsive, requesting guidance. It was a technically accurate description of what his instruments showed him. It was also the most convenient available explanation for a pilot who had just been comprehensively outmaneuvered and needed a narrative that didn't require him to report that a maritime patrol aircraft had defeated his intercept attempt without maneuvering. The final element of the American response was not electronic. It was presence. A B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, based at RAF Fairford in England, capable of carrying 40,000 pounds of precision munitions with a radar cross-section roughly equivalent to a large bird, had been orbiting over the Black Sea for the duration of the incident. It had not appeared on any Russian radar scope. It had not announced itself. It had simply been there, cataloging everything, waiting. When the B-2's radar signature was deliberately allowed to appear on the Su-27 pilot's display, a controlled revelation, not an accidental detection, it appeared at a firing position 50 nautical miles from his aircraft. A position from which, had it chosen to act at any point during the preceding engagement, the outcome would have been final and non-negotiable. The pilot had been operating inside the targeting envelope of an asset he didn't know existed, for a period of time he couldn't calculate. From 80 nautical miles, the F/A-18E Super Hornet fired. The AIM-120 that left its launcher carried no warhead. It was a live missile body with an active motor and a functional seeker, stripped of its explosive payload and reconfigured as a kinetic signal, a precision-guided message delivered at supersonic speed. It passed the Su-27's nose at 200 feet of separation. The sonic boom registered in the Russian pilot's cockpit as a physical event. The missile's motor tone was broadcast simultaneously over the international emergency frequency. No words were transmitted, none were necessary. The Su-27 broke off, the Su-30s disengaged. The submarine continued its patrol, unaware of how thoroughly it had been tracked. The Russian formation returned to their respective bases, and the Russian government subsequently characterized the entire episode as a routine training exercise that had proceeded as planned. The U.S. Department of Defense released the P-8A's sensor recordings within 48 hours. High-resolution optical imagery of the Su-27's close pass. Radar track data documenting the barrel roll geometry. Electronic warfare logs showing the jamming attempt and the countermeasure response. The recordings were not classified. They were published. Russia's private military failure became a public technical assessment available to every defense ministry, every air force, and every intelligence service that wanted to understand what U.S. maritime patrol aircraft can do when someone tests them. What made the American response effective was not any single system. It was the architecture that connected them, the secure data link backbone that allowed a satellite, an AWACS, a maritime patrol aircraft, a surface warship, a helicopter, 2 carrier-based fighters, and a stealth bomber to operate as a single integrated sensing and response network, sharing a common picture, acting on shared information, each platform's capability multiplied by its connection to every other. The Russian pilots were flying alone. The American crews were nodes in a system that had no equivalent on the other side of this engagement. Russia committed 2 Su-27s, 2 Su-30s, and a Kilo-class submarine to an operation designed to demonstrate regional dominance. What they demonstrated instead was the precise location of the ceiling above which their electronic warfare capabilities, their data link architecture, and their operational coordination cannot compete. American analysts noted all of it. The electronic signatures of every radar mode the Russian aircraft employed were logged for future exploitation. The jamming parameters of the Su-27 systems were captured and will inform future electronic warfare programming updates. The submarine's acoustic signature was added to the classification library. The intelligence harvest from an incident Russia framed as a training exercise will inform U.S. Navy operations in the Black Sea region for years. The FA-18E Super Hornets established a patrol perimeter around the P-8A after the Russian aircraft departed and flew additional laps while the AWACS tracked the retreating contacts until they dropped below the radar horizon. Then the patrol continued. The P-8A completed its assigned track. The crew logged their data, secured their systems, and flew home. For the sailors and aviators involved, it was a significant incident handled with textbook precision. For the systems they operated, it was a performance within design parameters. For Moscow's military planners, it was an unusually detailed accounting of exactly how much of their tactical playbook the United States can read, counter, and document before the first move is complete. The Black Sea remained international airspace. The P-8A's right to operate there was not diminished by 1 degree. And somewhere in a classified after-action debrief, a Russian pilot was explaining to his superiors how a reconnaissance aircraft had defeated his intercept attempt using nothing but discipline, data, and the cold mathematics of information superiority. Which element of the American response do you think carried the most strategic weight? The electronic countermeasure that turned the Su-27's own radar lock into a weapon against him? Or the B-2's silent presence that revealed the United States had controlled the entire operational environment from the start? Drop your assessment in the comments. If you want more breakdowns of real-world incidents and the systems behind them, subscribe and hit the notification bell.